The sea off Dragonstone wore a winter face still, all iron-gray plates and white seams where waves split on hidden teeth. Wind hissed across the basalt spurs of the island and hurled spray high enough to reach the empty embrasures. In the pre-dawn gloom, the castle was a crouched beast listening for approach, and Jon Snow stood at its outer wall with the smell of salt and kelp in his beard and the ache in his right shoulder that cold weather always woke. He had come to love the sound the sea made, its relentless question. What next? Break and break again. He heard the footfall before the voice, the sharp, deliberate walk of someone who was confident where their feet were. Steps that belonged on a deck rather than a castle stair. You could fall, Yara Greyjoy said, drawing up beside him. She wore no cloak despite the chill, letting the wind tug her salt-stiff hair sideways. The rocks down there would like a share of the king in the north. I've fallen farther, Jon said, letting the lie pass as jest. He glanced toward the east where the faintest wash of color softened the horizon. You came early. You called early. Her eyes were on the water, steady, as if speaking to another captain just out of sight. You've news on my uncle? I have thoughts, Jon said, and when she made a face, he added, and something better, a chance at him. At that she looked full at him, all humor emptied. There were lines around her mouth that hadn't been there when he first met her in the great hall at Winterfell. Grief put such lines on the face, and years on the heart. The ghost of her brother lived somewhere behind her stare. Theon had died bravely at Winterfell, and all of them carried that death in different ways. Yara carried it like a stone in a pocket. Present, weighty, not to be thrown. Jon braced his forearms on the cold parapet. You know his habits. You've told us as much. Euron sails soundless when it suits him, fast, takes risk to make a bigger prize, and if he thinks he sees a weakness, he takes it. He isn't a man, Yara said low. He's a storm that learned to walk in boots. Storms have patterns, Jon said, and we know what he needs. He needs to keep the Blackwater open. He needs to frighten Daenerys. He paused, letting the name sit between them. He'll be out there as soon as our sails show, waiting along the headlands, hiding behind the lee of some small island or rock where the currents feed him. Yara made a small sound. You think that because he bloodied her once, he'll try for a second break of skin? Jon nodded. He had seen dragons up close now. He had ridden one. The memory of air whipping his face and the world turned to toy, the knowledge that a misstep meant the kind of fall no man survived. He held all that without tremor. Still, he had watched the second dragon limp in pain after Winterfell, and had seen the fleet at Dragonstone burn in the mind of every man and woman here as if they had all been aboard. If he takes the sea from us, he cuts our legs before we stand. If he destroys our ships again, he frightens Daenerys into acting alone, and we lose the city or we lose her. He didn't say what he meant. Lose her to rage. The wind said it for him in a low moan through the arrow slits. Yara watched the water as if Euron might surface like a leviathan. And your thoughts are what? We hunt him instead, Jon said. Not with dragons at first. With you. She laughed, sharp, incredulous. Hunt him. With me. As if I haven't tried to kill my own blood since I grew into a sword arm. You wanted to retake your islands. You wanted to throw him off your father's chair. I'm asking something different. Jon shifted his hands. Cold had sank deep into the stone. He found a warmer patch where morning's first hint laid a ghost of pink. Leave him no sea to hide in. You know the narrows better than any on our side. You know where the winds are fickle, where currents pull a fool into rocks, where a captain too sure of himself reaches for the wind and finds only lull. He thinks he's the only shark. Make him the prey. And with what ships? Yara asked. We have enough wood to move an army if the air is kind. We do not have an armada to scour 1,000 coves. Jon had known the question, and the answer was the hard truth of what he had become since the night at the wall and the night in the Godswood. Someone who asked others to carry the edges of risk. You have the best of what we have, he said. Fast, hard to see, shallow draft. Your men are born to tide and theft. I want you to take 3 squadrons east and south. Show a flank you know he can't help but bite. He believes he cannot be outthought. Give him a reason to chase, then choke the channel and make a noose. And where will your dragon queen be while I string my rope? Yara asked. Up in her mountain counting teeth? Or swooping down to ruin it because the sight of my uncle turns her blood hot? She'll be high, Jon said, and patient. She's agreed to be patient if a path exists that spares the city. A gust took his cloak and snapped it like a sail. I told her there was such a path. She trusts you. Yara looked at him then as if he were made of something thinner than skin. You must be a better liar than I thought, Snow. She trusts me because you trust me, and she trusts you because she wants to. I told her that if we let you loose, you'll find him, Jon said. He tried a smile. It sat crooked on his mouth. And when you do, you'll keep him looking away from the sky at the moment he should look up. She held his gaze, saw the shape of the plan there, and a slow, dark satisfaction found light enough to show in her face. You mean to have him watch me and forget to watch the sun? If Euron dies on the water, Jon said, the capital falls with little blood. He's the spine of her fear. Break him, and the rest can't stand against dragons and armies. And you take from him the thing he loves most. Not power. Fear. The sea. For a few breaths the wind was the only voice, and then Yara nodded once, as if marking a course on a map. I'll need sailors beyond my own and some who aren't fools. A man who knows the hidden rocks between Driftmark and the mouth of Shipbreaker Bay. A shipwright who can rig net and chain quickly, and permission to take boats into waters deemed cursed because old gods had a thought there once. I'll need signal beacons along the cliffs that can be seen by dragon from 3 leagues out, and I'll need you to keep the queen out of range until the scorpions are turned. You'll have them, Jon said. Yara blew out a breath that fogged in the chill. And if your queen cannot be patient, then I'll keep her so. Jon felt the words bind themselves to him like a vow. Yara looked away. My brother died a good death. I owe him a worse uncle's. We sail on the night tide. When they parted, the sky was already lighter. Gulls wheeled low and shrieked argument with the wind. Jon watched their fight become play and then turned and took the long stairs down into Dragonstone, where the warm breath of kitchens rubbed his face and the smell of fresh bread made him suddenly and terribly hungry. He ate standing in the shadow of the war table while Tyrion nursed a cup and watched him over the rim. You look as if you've married trouble, Tyrion said. He had the prompt humor he wore to cover the way he never stopped counting risks, the way his eyes darted to the edges of the room as if counsel itself could be ambushed. Yara will hunt Euron, Jon said. Tyrion swallowed and set down his cup. I think I like the music of that sentence more than the content. Does she expect success or simply the pleasure of the attempt? She expects to kill him, Jon said. I expect her to do it. You've become an optimist, Tyrion said. It never sat easily on you. Be careful. People who smile at storms often get strange looks when the ship starts to sink. Jon ran his finger along the carved river on the table. He had stood in this room with Stannis once, and later with Daenerys. Men and women with different fires in them had placed the same pebbles to mark fleets and armies, and the sea had been the same uncarved shape around them, indifferent, always moving. He said, if Euron lives, we risk everything. If he dies, we can take the city without fire. Ah, Tyrion said, soft. Without fire. He was honest enough not to hide the relief in those words, and tired enough not to hide the fear either. Jon looked up. She listens to you. She listens because she has less and less to lean on that doesn't burn, Tyrion said. And there are voices in her silence now. Her trusted circle is small and smaller. Yara is dead. Missandei's counsel is still, but she cannot give what Yara gave, history and a lover's sternness. Grey Worm speaks only a narrow truth. Varys watches and is watched. I speak, and she thinks of my sister. He tilted his head. She listens to you because you are honest with her in a way none of us dare anymore. That honesty hurts her, but she still wants it. Jon thought of the cave beyond the wall where Ygritte had pulled him down by the cloak, the steam rising in ghost ribbons from the water, the first time he had said what was in his heart without counting the cost, and of what came after. Honesty is only a path, he said at last. It doesn't tell you where it leads. They were silent then until the door opened and Daenerys entered, a cape furred with black fox at her shoulders. Regal's healed scars a pale web along her left wrist where the dragon had brushed her in wild flight. She removed the cape herself. She needed no squire. The bare, carved dragons of the table watched her as if remembering a different queen. "You have her?" she asked. She never used names when her blood was hot. She was a queen in that habit. Names were for the equal. "Yara sails tonight," Jon said. "She will draw him out." "And you will restrain me?" Daenerys said. So simply he felt the truth like a hand on his throat. She came to the table and stood opposite him. "Will you?" "Yes," he said. He meant I will stand between you and whatever breaks you, though he knew sometimes he would be the thing that broke her if mercy demanded it. Daenerys looked down at the carved river where his finger had made a bright streak. "If he kills her, she won't be killed easily," Jon said. "She is not my fear," Daenerys said, lifting her eyes. "My fear is that I am. I have been told and told that I am wind at the end of a long winter, a storm unbottled. If I untie it once too far..." She closed her hand and opened it. "There are no knots left." Tyrion spoke then with all the tact he kept honed in his pocket. "If Euron falls, you'll not need to untie anything. The Golden Company do not have elephants, but they have a good instinct for the balance of winning. Their captains care for coin and survival. Without Euron's fleet, they will see little of either and much of dragon." Daenerys regarded him without flashing annoyance, which was a smarter and kinder habit she had grown since the snows. "And Cersei? Cersei will drink until her teeth ache," Tyrion said lightly. "But she will want to live. I know her. When the bells ring, she will go pale and think of children. She did once." "She used to," Daenerys said. "It was decided before it was debated, and so the day moved that way. Messages sent out on the feathered backs of ravens. Carpenters from the narrow villages of Driftmark brought up to the Dragonstone yard and told to fashion chain like a fisherman's dream. Small boats scraped of barnacle to make them fleet. Sailors from the Reach and the Vale and the Iron Islands gathered and split under Yara's sharp tongue into crews that looked more like knives than nets. Davos came up from the harbor, smelling of tar and judgment, to curse about currents and debate the timing of tides. The afternoon wore on into short even. ING that looked longer for being so trampled by need. Jon found Daenerys again at the western balcony, where the stone warmed quickly under sun. Regal lifted and settled his scarred wing, testing air. Drogon was a dark hum at the edge of their awareness, sleeping on a far spur where salt had cooked into a crust on the rock. The queen's hair was unbraided, thrown over one shoulder in a loose rope. The wind gnawed at it until strands escaped and whipped like banners. "I was thinking of bells," she said without greeting. "In Meereen, when we tore the slavers' banners down, the bells ran mad with relief. Their sound was a kind of sob. Men fell to their knees and women laughed like they'd seen a new sky. Here, when the bells ring, do you think the sound will feel the same? Bells are lumps of metal. It's men's hearts that change the sound," Jon said. She gave him a look that said he was trying to be wise and only managing common. "I know what they are. Will you be in the streets to hear it if it comes?" "I will be where you need me to be," he said. She had learned him enough to be annoyed at that answer. "I need you with me," she said, "to remind me to breathe when I forget there are lungs in me that do not blow fire." She turned, leaned her hip against the stone, and sighed. "I used to know who I was. A little girl with a brother's hand on her shoulder. A wife to a man who taught me to live and died almost as soon as I learned it. A breaker of chains. And then I came here, and every time I think I have a shape, the snow smooths it." "Snow melts," he said, and her mouth quirked despite herself. "Not quickly in the north," she said. Then she was all straight back and crown again. "Yara sails tonight. You could sleep," Jon ventured. She laughed once, a dry roll like a pebble down a cliff. "I don't think I remember the road to that house." They watched the sun sink. The day became small as a coin, and then it was night, and they were present for the moment Yara's sails left the dark harbor and passed like ghosts under the stone dragon's wings. The hunt did not begin with trumpet or clash. It began with wind falling slack and then freshening, with moonlight shattering on chop, with the creak of rope and the steady soft swear of sailors as they adjusted to the sea's answer. Yara stood at the prow of her flagship. No, flagship was a word for the silence, for her uncle's arrogance. Her ship was only a ship, and that humility made it lethal. She wore mail and leather, and on her hip a hand axe with a nick the shape of a moon in its blade. She had a way of standing that made it plain she understood she floated by the indulgence of larger forces. Tide, wind, luck, and that she meant to charm those forces with nerve as much as skill. They cut east first, not toward the Blackwater where Euron might lurk like a spider in a corner, but toward the tangle of islets off Driftmark where old castles had once been and were now only humps of stone tufted with stubborn grass and gulls' nests. There where the water ran deceptively black beneath and currents slid like snakes over rock, she sent 2 squadrons to drift with little sail. The third she kept tight, as if she worried over them, as if protecting something she wished Euron to covet. On the second night, cloud came down and sat on the water. The world shortened to a few ship lengths. Sound traveled oddly, oars heartbeats away, gulls a league off seeming to scream in the ear. Yara welcomed the fog with a grin that bit. She had made love in fog, killed in fog, stolen futures in fog, and she meant to give her uncle a taste of his own blinding medicine. They set their beacons in the cliffs above the narrows along a line Davos had charted, and when each was lit it was a dull orange coin that burned and smoked without flickering. So unlike torch flame it looked a different element entirely. Those beacons had meaning, where to turn a ship, where to drop chain, where to hold still and become another bit of rock. High above, nothing moved in the white, but the dragons had risen at dusk, and Daenerys circled them out beyond sight where the fog thinned into stratus and the moon made a bright road. On the third night, the sea told of him. It wasn't sight. The fog was too thick and the dark too deep. It was the feeling a trained crew had, a change in the water's tension, the tiny lilt that meant a large hull displacing a lot of black weight somewhere out there. It was the way birds went silent and then burst into sound in a different place. It was Yara's jaw tightening and the little twitch under her eye she never honored by naming. She lifted a hand in a gesture that would have been nothing to a landsman. Sails trimmed, oars shipped. The ship fell to the small forward motion that matched the current while the fog pressed lint-soft against cheek and brow. Silence grew denser, and then a shape slid by to port so near a man could have thrown an apple and hit it. Crew held breath. Yara didn't spare it a glance. Her eyes were on the place her beacon had marked, where the chain lay wound like a sleeping serpent around the base of a new carved wooden post hammered into a seam in the cliff rock. She lifted both hands, almost lazily. 2 boats slipped from shadows and slid toward the base of the cliff more soundless than seals. On the third approach another shape loomed ahead, taller, wide of beam, the particular arrogance of a ship that had been built with fear of nothing. Even without the painted shields, without the mouth sewn shut on her figurehead, Yara knew the line of the silence. Her uncle was near. She felt it the way a family feels sickness. She had never believed in omens until she had to. Then sound, the twang and thrum of torsion, a chain's clink, and the blunt comparative whisper of an arrow's enormous body cutting fog. The scorpion bolt came for her mast, guessed rather than aimed, and it buried itself in a sail that was already furled. Punch. Ed threw with a shudder and fell uselessly into black water with a hiss. Now, Yara said, and the men at the cliff levered and heaved. The chain that had been sleeping leaped awake and with a wet roar came up out of the black, looped, and tightened across the mouth of the channel. The first prow struck it hard enough to ring like a bell. Iron on iron, iron on wood. Then men shouting pitched high when their breath left them at speed and rebounded. Then the scuffle skid of boots as crews tried to reverse a momentum already gone to anger. Rope! Yara cried, and her ships threw rope like they had been waiting their whole lives to bind something wicked. Hooks bit into hulls, grapples clanged. The men who had cursed themselves asleep in 1,000 small harbors under 1,000 leaky roofs found themselves suddenly fierce and awake and with a dream they could hold. Fire! Someone said, eagerness breaking discipline. No, Yara snapped. No fire. Let them see what the sea feels like when it's a trap. Euron's voice crested the fog. He sounded happy. "Niece," the word smeared with ale and contempt. "Come to give me a kiss goodnight?" Another scorpion thudded. Wrong angle, wrong tension. Snapped cable shrieked like some cliff-born creature dying. Yara raised her head toward the blank of the sky. In fog each sound was a rumor. She knew this rumor by heart. The heavy cloth rip of membrane and muscle working together. The deep-bellied whoosh of a dragon beating air into a new shape. She could not see him yet, so she made sure Euron had reason to be looking at her. She shouted more orders than strictly needed. Let men hammer at chains and curse at hooks. Let the sound churn until every ear on every deck had its attention straight ahead. The fog thinned for a heartbeat like a curtain blown by breath. Above that breath, something darker than the dark leaned into the white and then slid out of it. Euron squinted up. It had no shape at first. It was simply absence of light. Then fire. Regal came out of the fog not like a comet. Comets were romantic lies, but like the sudden hot mouth of a kiln somebody had left the door open on. His flame entered fog, and the fog went to steam and then to rain all in one rushing second. At the range Daenerys kept, scorpions were toys. Their cables were wet. Their crews were shocked by the change in air. Their captain was so busy laughing at his niece, he forgot to bend his head back farther and farther to imagine what sky a dragon commanded. The first bolt loosed up and wide. The second burned in air inside the dragon's throat and fell, curving. A thing that had wanted to be an arrow and instead became a falling sun. Then the third scorpion never fired at all, because the silence's stern turned as if in indecision and smacked hard into another ship caught in Yara's chain. Men went down in a tangle of limbs and curses. Yara's crews hauled, locked, kept Euron from finding any angle, gave him only choices between bad and worse. Euron salted. He threw his hat aside. He wore a ridiculous hat, always had, and leaped to the rail with an axe. Before any of Euron's men could leap across and make the fight a general confusion, Yara took one step and then another, and the world narrowed to the place where one line met another. Euron saw her and understood something he had not understood until that moment. That she had not come to test him or drive him off or distract him. She had come to end him. They met at the moment both ships came up against chain. The impact thumped through their legs. Euron grinned wider, and Yara's half-smile vanished. He swung with his right-hand axe. An oblique blow meant not to cleave but to hook and drag. Yara ducked it by an inch and answered with a tight, mean cut that aimed at his knee. He shifted left, took the slice in the meat of his thigh instead of through sinew, and roared a laugh that had real delight in it. "Blood!" he cried, as if calling up a good wind. "Blood?" Yara said flatly, and feinted with her axe to make his right-hand guard widen, then put a dagger into his left near the ribs, all the way to the hilt. He gasped once in surprise, not pain, and the surprise had a child's quality. He'd never thought she'd come this close. Then he bit at her hand like an animal, and when she jerked back he took his left-hand axe and chopped down at the rope that kept their ships kissing. Cut half through. The knot held. It always came down to knots. He lunged. She pivoted. Their boots skidded on wet planks. Behind them men screamed where boiling steam rolled off the water and scalded bare arms. Above them the dragons passed like swift weather. "Do you think dragons will keep you queen?" Euron demanded over the grating slam of wood. He'd lost something in his voice that had nothing to do with breath. "Do you think they last? Everything you love burns. That's their trick. Everything you love drowns," Yara said. She head-butted him so that his nose went flat and hot blood flooded his mouth. He snarled and spat and stumbled, and then there was no more talk. He swung. She swung. His guard grew sloppy as blood took a tithe. One of Yara's men died trying to climb across the gap to take a CLE, and shot at Euron's back. Yara did not spare him a glance because death is a sea you can mourn full only when the fight's done. Euron brought one axe in a small tight circle that bit into her shoulder guard and lodged there. He reached to wrench it free and could not. In the second of effort it took, Yara stepped into him the way a wave steps over a rock and drove her hand axe in a flat, straight strike that went under the ribs and up into the dark behind them. She felt the change. Not a shudder. An inland tremor, the sudden slack where there had been terrible insistence. He grunted, eyes bright with surprise and real anger then. Anger at how ordinary the end was. Wood underfoot, wet air, the smell of pitch and brine and blood. He tried to say something witty. Euron always had a line. He found only wetness. Yara kicked his legs out. He fell hard. Daenerys landed regal on a cliff where heat shimmered up from rock. Drogon hovered once, twice, then settled beyond. She had waited and not burned. Jon came up behind her with his hair plastered to his forehead by spray, half-smile raw and unguarded. And he put his hand on her back the way a man might touch a horse he has learned to trust, with warmth and no claim. She did not look at him. She watched Yara walk across the Silence's deck and lift her uncle's ridiculous hat and toss it into the sea. It floated a long time and then went under as if remembering it had always been foolish. With Euron dead, the sea changed. You cannot see such a change. Charts looked the same. The wind blew where it pleased. But men who had thought themselves wolves and sharks looked at the sky and thought twice. The Golden Company sent a message that made Tyrion snort laughter into his wine. They inquire as to conditions of surrender, he told Jon. That might preserve their pay. He shook his head. Mercenaries are honest in their way. We'd rather they leave, Jon said. We'd rather the city not fight street by street. I'd rather a great many things, Tyrion said. I'd rather my sister had been a different woman, and my father a different man. Cersei made a show of defiance in the Red Keep, pacing along the high walks with Qyburn at her shoulder and Ser Gregor a mountain painted in man-shape behind her. She had the scorpions loaded and tested, but few men had heart for aiming them at a dragon that had killed their fear and left only awe. It is hard to draw a bead on something you have already decided is your god. Varys grew quieter, and then in an evening that smelled of damp earth and spring, he came to Jon in the lower yard where entertainment had been set up to keep the men too busy to quarrel. She is raw, he said without preface. But today she is not a knife. Today, Jon said, I have been mostly wrong in my life when I thought myself most right, Varys said mildly. And yet we must try to choose as if we know. He put his hands together like a man at prayer. I will not move against her, not while she can choose restraint, not while she will choose it. Jon said nothing. It was a night when silence did more work than speech. They starved the city only a little, just enough to thin the confidence. They showed dragons over the bay at dawn and dusk, never closer than she had sworn not to go. Yara went west to the islands to pull down the last of her uncle's flags. News of Euron's death arrived in the city like a gust through a shutter. Doors that had been barred opened. The gold cloaks looked at one another and remembered they were men who liked to live. The people, who have a way of knowing when the tide turned even if not one eye among them ever looked at water, started to watch the sky not as doom but as weather that might finally break heat. Jaime rode south alone and reached them outside the city walls at night after a day of rain. His arrival made the camp's gossip boil. Brienne had watched him go back to a woman the world called monster. He had left because he believed monsters weren't born but made together, and that he had made himself one more than once. He looked like a man who hadn't slept because a set of thoughts wouldn't release him, and who knew sleep wouldn't help anyway. Tyrion took him into the tent they still called the map room out of habit, and they embraced without ceremony. Our sister is going to lose, Tyrion said. I need to say that out loud in front of us both. Say it again, Jaime said. His face did a strange thing then, somewhere between smile and flinch. She is going to lose, Tyrion said softly, and I do not want her to die for it. Jaime's eyes closed. Neither do I, he whispered. But she will if you take her. She will if she does not surrender, Tyrion said. Can you make her surrender? She never surrendered in her life, Jaime said. He sat on a low stool like a man who had just learned he could rest in the middle of a step. I can try. She may listen to me once more. I don't know. I have never been so ignorant of a woman I thought I knew. He rubbed his face. She is with child. Tyrion winced. Whose? Jaime looked up at him, and for a moment he was just a brother. Does it matter? Tyrion lifted a hand. Let it drop. Everything matters and nothing matters, he said. Go. Try. If you bring her down alive. In the morning, the dragons flew high and slow like omens returned to the realm of the rational. The infantry set in lines they had practiced until sweat had washed the fear into something that felt like habit. The Unsullied formed their hard square at the center. The Dothraki, what remained of them, warmed their horses and rolled their shoulders and laughed with a tense, brittle joy. Davos kept the ships tight in the mouth of the Blackwater to keep the city from food and from flight. Yara kept a small vanguard at the cape near where the wildfire had burned years ago, and let the ghosts there know there would be no repeat. Tyrion and Jon rode forward with a small white flag. The gate opened not because the queen had ordered it, but because the gold cloaks at the gate had decided that opening it was smarter than refusing and looking foolish. They were met by Qyburn under a little canopy that kept the drizzle off his lean shoes. He looked like a sparrow who had eaten a fox and was trying to convince everyone it had always been a mouse. His mouth smiled. His eyes did not. "Her Grace the Queen will not surrender," he said. "The people will," Tyrion said. "You know this. People do as they are told," Qyburn said. "Your own short life should have taught you that. If they are told poorly and fed grief," Tyrion said. "We are offering the better command. Live. Ring the bells." Qyburn's smile chipped a little. "Her Grace will not ring them." He lifted a hand as if to smooth the air. "She knows you. She knows your sister, and you are on the same keel in one way. You both put love above duty." Tyrion had the grace to shrug. "If I wore a priest's robe, that would sound noble. Instead it sounds like strategy that will fail," Qyburn said. "Go back. Take down your dragons, and we will talk of terms." "That's a splendid inversion of events," Tyrion said. "We have the dragons. You have the walls. When you find yourself making an offer that ignores that, you should examine the state of your arguments." Qyburn inclined his head, not without respect. "You have always been clever with words. Words are only boxes for truths," Tyrion said. "Today the truth is that you stand before us because you are afraid. Your queen is afraid, and fear makes fools of all of us." He held up a single finger. "One thing only. Tell her that her brother asks her to live. Tell her that if the bells ring, the dragons will not burn the city." Qyburn drew in a breath and then let it out very slowly. "I will tell her," he said. He did, and she said something that used the old word that meant and does not only women. He returned and did not say that to Tyrion, because Qyburn had a clerkly mind that disliked any admission of how things were, and he preferred his own small grammar of cruelty to the rich worlds of other men's speech. The morning gathered itself into a fist and then loosened again. Time in siege days went thin, stretched across taut needs. Jon sat his horse and watched the gate. Daenerys waited above the clouds with Rhaegal and Drogon, patient and terrible. Grey Worm stood like a carved thing. Missandei stood near him, a quiet presence the men had come to note with a kind of reverence after Meereen and the liberation. She had a soft word for fear that worked better than many hard words. She moved among the men who would cross that ground if the bells did not ring, and she looked them in the eyes and called some by name, and then she stepped back and folded her hands. They heard it first as a mistaken sound, a clatter of some fallen thing on stone. Then a thin ringing that could have been a small boy playing at noise. Then it spread, the way a single bird takes flight and the whole tree erupts into air without any one bird meaning it. The bells rang. They rang from a dozen towers. They rang as if the city had discovered it had a heart where a furnace had been. The sound came thin on the first wind, then full as the breeze turned. Men swayed. Some of the Dothraki laughed with tears on their faces. Grey Worm stood very still and closed his eyes, and Missandei reached for his hand and held it. Jon looked up even though he knew the dragons were far too high to see. He looked because he wanted to believe the sky felt the same release the ground did. The gates opened. The gold cloaks threw down their belts with their short swords in them. They moved back and spread their hands a little. The people poured out as if pulled by a tide, women with baskets, men with dirt ground into their faces, children with that stunned look children where after they have seen a god and found it is not the one their mother said would come. They didn't cheer. They didn't scream. They made a sound like breath finding a throat again. Daenerys brought the dragons down not to the street, the space would not have held them, but to the head of the Blackwater where the wind was sure and the smell of salt meant safety. She stood between them on the rocks where the spray leapt and hissed. She waited until the sound of bells had no breaks in it anymore and then lifted one hand so that it glinted with the water on it, and both great heads bent, and she was a woman between gods who had taught them humility. "Fly over the city once," she told Drogon, and he did, high, slow, with no flame, and that flight told more than banners. Cersei did not come out. She stood at a window looking down at the flood of little lives and would not be moved. Jaime found her there. He had reached the Keep Throw. Jaecha postern he had helped seal years ago, and no one had unlearned that seal. He walked on stone he knew better than his own lines in the face, and in the long room where her father once weighed men's lives like coin, there she was, a silhouette of someone he had loved long and wrong. "Jaime," she said, a statement, no surprise. Her hand was on her belly. He saw that even before he saw her eyes. "You've come to see me beg. I've come to ask you to live," he said. He closed the door behind him. Ser Gregor stood beyond it, and when Jaime looked, the huge head shifted. The lipless non-mouth parted a little, as if curious that an old opponent still lived. Cersei laughed once, shards in it. "Live for what?" She turned her head a little. "For him." Her hand pressed the dress at her stomach. "He will never be safe in a world where she breathes." "Then we must make the world different," Jaime said. "That's what everyone says now. Break the wheel. Start a new one. If you die like this, the only thing you will have broken is your own neck." She looked at him then with a nakedness that made him swallow. "You never were as funny as you thought," she said. "The old insult, the old love." She stepped close to him, and he felt the shape of who they had been and understood it like a language he could no longer speak without sin. "You came to kill me once. Did you come to be merciful now? Do you think mercy will sew you a better shroud?" "I came to love you," he said simply, "as I always did, and to ask you to drop this fight and live among those who will forgive you because they need to believe they can forgive themselves." She trembled once, one of those deep tremors that shakes a house as if some old river beneath it has shifted. He reached for her hand. She let him take it, and they stood like that a long breath of time. He felt her fighting herself the way he had fought his own baser tides for years. Her eyes filled with wet, and when the first tear fell it surprised them both, and she made a sound like an animal caught in a snare. She leaned into him. He held her with the arm that once had worn gold, and in that moment he believed her saved. Then the castle trembled for a different reason. Far below, where Qyburn had tucked little green vials among the tunnels and old rooms, one careless spark, an apprentice's dropped torch, a desperate man's foolish thought, had found what it hungered for. A gout of green flame kicked down a corridor. Two men became shadows on stone. The bells rang and did not stop, and beneath them, deep in the keep, in the places where dragons had been chained once and still left a smell like old iron, fire woke that was not dragon's fire. The first explosion shook dust from beams. The second rolled up a stair and spat it out on a landing where Mad King's ghosts might have smiled. Jaime felt the vibration and knew the taste of wildfire from the old days. "What did you do?" he asked, although he knew she had not. She stepped back, horrified like a child who had knocked over a lantern and set her house alight. The mountain moved forward automatically to shield her body with his unliving bulk. Qyburn came stumbling in, the dust making him look briefly like a man who had gone gray in a blink. "My queen," he said, a little hysteric laugh in the Mai. "We must go. There has been, some ignition." "Some ignition," Jaime said flatly. "We did not light it," Qyburn said sharply. "Someone else who matters. The point is to control the spread." He gestured. "There are dampers. Doors we may close. Come." They left by the southern corridor, Jaime's hand warm around Cersei's. They went down a stair he had carried their children up once, into the smaller hall where tapestries made of lions hunting stags looked like they might leap down to do it truly. The next explosion took a bite out of a section of far wall and sent smoke like a curling finger into the room. Men ran. Jaime turned to meet a shape that came out of the smoke. But the shape was a man, not an enemy. Sandor Clegane, the Hound, his face a ruin that remembered older ruin, his eyes on something past Jaime's shoulder, his brother. He did not look at Jaime long enough to weigh him. He looked at the mountain as a man looks at the old curse of his life. "Move," he told the others. "This is mine." Qyburn put out a hand, half daring. The mountain moved it away with a casualness that broke bone and idea both. Qyburn died at the foot of his own creation without even the dignity of a surprised exclamation. Cersei pressed herself into the wall to get past. Jaime tugged her hand. The Hound and the mountain met in that stare like geology, like slow, ancient forces finally allowed to speak. It was ugly and inevitable and went beyond skill to the core of something broken that wanted to be broken in the open and be done. Jaime did not stay to watch. He took Cersei down another stair, then another, following the paths he knew that led to the lowest cellars and, from there, to the postern tunnels that bled toward the river. Arya had followed the Hound into the keep. She tasted ash and the old taste of lists kept alive solely by a child's stubbornness. She had come for a name and found a different task as the green fire licked into hallways where the people who had believed the bells meant salvation now tried to flee. She turned away from the path where Cersei would be and went instead where a woman pulled at a door that had swelled with damp and would not open. She threw her shoulder against it and it opened. She took a boy by the scruff and put him into his mother's shaking arms. She found others, shepherded them, shoved them when they froze, slapped one man hard whose panic had made him stupid and useless. She found a boy with an open burn down his forearm and bound it with someone's discarded scarf. She found, in the end, that vengeance is a small fire that goes out when larger flames lick closer. In the corridor where the Hound and the mountain fought, stone cracked under the mountain's weight and will. Dingy light shafted in through breaks in the walls. Sandor laughed as he drove a blade into the monstrous chest and pulled it out and saw only a little dark and no stagger. "You're empty," he said almost joyfully. "Then there's nothing in you to love what you are." He let the mountain strike him down, got up. The second time it took longer. The third time his hand found something, the hilt of the sword he had thrown away years ago in something like contempt. He swung it up and, finding no heart to take, took a head instead. It was stubborn, came free at last with a wet sound. The mountain stood a moment headless and then fell as if the force that had animated him had finally been recalled by whatever devil had made him, impatient at last. Sandor slipped down the wall and sat with blood on his lips. He looked up. There was a hole where roof had been. Gray sky looked down not kindly and not curious. He laughed again, softer, like a man who had just remembered the best and only funny thing. "Little bird," he said to someone not there, and then he let his head lean back and stared until his eyes did not see. In the postern tunnels, the heat drew wind into the passages and made the light flicker like cruel candles tubs. Jaime and Cersei reached a door at last that opened to a short run down to a little dock where boats would have been waiting once as a lord's habit. There were no boats now. The water chopped and glowed dully with a residue of something green burned to brown. The air was hot and damp and tasted old. "There's nowhere," Cersei said, the words flat under shock. "There's nowhere." Jaime turned her face to his. "There is if you live," he said. He felt for a ledge with his foot. The way was more difficult than he had remembered from younger legs. Stone fell with the small choughs of pieces meeting water. "We can go along the wall to the next chamber. There'll be a way up." She let him lead. She moved with less grace than she had ever borne. In that moment she was only a woman who had commanded too much and believed too little and found herself now in the middle of a road not built for her. They went step and step, and the next explosion came from somewhere above, and the ceiling in that corridor fell not in. It fell gently, strangely, a slow and heavy yielding that let them scramble back before the worst of it. Dust threw a shroud over them. The bells rang and the sound got into their bones until they could not tell bell from heartbeat. At the next cross corridor, he heard men's voices. He called. They were not lion men. They were men of the city with soot and fear on their faces, not knowing whether to run north or south. He gave them directions, made his voice the voice of a man who had always known these walls. They ran the way he pointed. They did not find another boat. They did not find the clean exit he had imagined. They found a place where the keep breathed with the bellows of heat below it and sighed with the exhaustion of stone. They sat down at last on a step because there were no more to take just then. Cersei's hand was sticky and gritty in his. He lifted it and kissed the grit as if it were incense. "Jaime," she said, "do you remember the green of summer?" He closed his eyes, and for a moment he saw a girl standing on the battlements at Casterly Rock, her hair lit like spilled honey, and a boy who had thought it a good idea to climb where no one else did because he believed the world existed to be climbed. "I do," he said. "It was so simple," she said. Tears had made clean tracks down her face. He had not seen her cry since their mother's funeral. "We were gods then. We were children with bad tutors," he said. He smiled, not unkindly. "And all the gods we learned about were only men in masks." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "I wanted to be loved," she said into the cloth of his sleeve. "I wanted to be queen because then love can't be taken away." He thought of a boy walking with his hand cut off and learning to draw with his left, learning to cook his own supper, to saddle his own horse, to be smaller in the world and therefore more. "It can," he said. "Everything can. But you can give Cersei. That can be taken only if you close your hand." He felt her shoulder shudder. He would not use the word forgive. It was too large for that tight stone chamber. They did not die there. A party of Unsullied, led by a lean soldier whose name Jon would never know and whose courage would never be sung, found the lower passages because Davos's maps and Euron's old stories had drawn a line there that more careful men had missed. They opened a door that had not been opened since a different king, and the air rushed at them as if grateful. They found a queen sitting beside a man who looked like a knight out of tale and took both into custody with efficient gentleness. One soldier looked at Cersei as if he expected her to spit fire. When she only got to her feet and came, he reassessed the shape of legend. By the time they reached the yard, the bells were a steady roll as calming as rain. The wildfire had been contained in 3 places with quick work and luck. The dragons perched where they could do no harm and much good by their presence. Grey Worm halted a dozen paces off and waited. "Your Grace," he said. He did not say the name Cersei. He had never loved the idea of names. They made people human who had made him less so.
Cersei met Daenerys Kees.
If there had been fire in one woman and ice in the other, they would have made a hiss to be told in song. As it was, there was only 2 women with everything they were and had been on their faces. Cersei wanted to flay with words and found her tongue heavy. Daenerys wanted to burn and found her lips still. Jon stood beside Daenerys and did not touch her because sometimes touch is a claim, not a comfort. "The city surrendered," Daenerys said. The words were simple. "You did not order it. The people made their choice. They are not you." Cersei's mouth turned, stubborn old pride flaring at least once more. "They are mine. They were," Daenerys said. "They have chosen. I will not punish them for loving life." She looked at Jaime then, and his tiredness looked like something she could believe in. She was not the first queen to find her belief in a man's exhaustion. "You spoke for her," she said. "You asked for mercy." "I ask still," Jaime said. He had dust in his hair and looked older by 10 years and somehow truer by 20. Daenerys lifted her head slightly. "She will not be executed," she said. Cersei's chin came up at that as if a sword had kissed it. "She will stand trial." Cersei laughed then. "A small brittle thing. In whose court? Who sits the judgment seat? Dragon Queen." Daenerys looked at Jon, then at Tyrion. The dwarf's eyes held hope the way a cracked cup holds water. Precariously, with much spilling and little to spare. "A great council," she said. "We will have one. The lords and ladies of Westeros will gather as they have not in living memory. You will have your say, and so will the realm." She took in Cersei's posture. It was almost relief. "And you will be judged fairly." Tyrion bowed his head. He had not expected that particular river to run into the sea, but sometimes a weather-worn cliff fell and a new course appeared. He thought of his brother and his brother's strange gift, to make even terrible things look possible if one only kept moving. The days that followed were the days no one wrote the songs about because they were too full of smallnesses. Broken doors repaired, wells cleared, bodies counted, and names matched to faces if name and face both remained. The dragons flew low along the river, carrying heavy loads of water in nets to dump over the stubborn green burn places. Grey Worm made order by standing still in a place where panic had stood. Missandei found the women who had been hurt and took them to cots and laid them there and stayed with them as they slept. Because sometimes sleep is only possible if you can see a face you trust in the waking moments between. Yara returned with 3 ships full of spoiled flags. She carried in her pocket the bone of some small sea creature she had found on a beach as a child. She told no one about it. She took a cup with Davos and told him how the chain had sung when it bit Euron's prow. He listened and nodded slowly because he had spent a lifetime listening to what seas said in different tongues. Sansa came south because the north would not be told what shape its future took by any wind from the south, dragon warm or not. She entered the throne room with her red hair bound tight and her eyes wide open. She looked at the throne as if at a piece of furniture someone had left in a room after moving, and then at her sister who stood by a window where a man would have set his back. Arya's hands had no blood on them. Sansa took that in with a quick little flare of something like gratitude. Bran came by carriage, watching through the crack opened in the curtain and through the eyes of a bird that had once been only a bird and now remembered too much. He did not smile. He rarely did. But he seemed more present here than he had under Winterfell's sky. Some places ask certain lives to be heavier. Some let them rest. When the Great Council gathered, the hall was a mosaic of histories, bright pieces set into a pattern that would shift and be shifted. There were lords with new-made cloaks and lords in moth-eaten velvet with sleeves begin to fray. There were ladies with eyes like knives and ladies with hands like bread. There was Gendry of Storm's End, newly made, his thick hands unashamed, sitting ill at ease in a chair that had never been asked to hold such a straightforward weight. There was Brienne in white, calm as water in a deep place. There was Samwell Tarly in Maester's robe that still looked like a costume until he spoke, and then it looked like clothing again. There was Yara in good leather, one boot muddy because she had stepped in it before entering and had laughed and not cared. Daenerys did not sit the Iron Throne. She stood before it. It was an old decision remade every hour since the bells, and she remade it. Tyrion stood at her right, Jon at her left, Varys in the crowd, his hands folded, his eyes moving, his mouth occasionally turning down when someone said something that forgot the poor. "We are here," Daenerys said, and her voice filled the hall not because of volume or dragons, but because it was a voice men remembered being surprised by. No tremor, no plea. "We are here because too many of us believed the only way to get what we needed was to sit on that chair." She glanced, only a glance, at the thing made of swords and fancy and 1,000 bad decisions. "I will not say it has no meaning. It has carved a shape into this realm that will not disappear because I wish it. But I say this to you. If you wish to continue as you were, with one city making all choices for all soil, you do so against my counsel and much good sense." They shifted and murmured like water over stone. "The North will not bend," Sansa said clearly. "We have bled too much and too long. We will be independent." The old argument knocked on doors, eager as always to be let I. And Gendry looked at the Queen, then at Jon. Missandei put a paper into Daenerys' hand, and the Queen did not read it because it had been written only so the act of writing it would teach Missandei what she wished to say. "I would not be my father," Daenerys said. "I would break the wheel. Today we begin. The North shall be free." Sansa's face did not change, but a small place near her throat moved as if air had finally found it. "And the rest of us?" Yara called, not rudely. "I have held to your pledge, your grace. I said I would take my men home and not raid the Reach while you fought. We will not be ruled by men who do not know tide. You will rule the Iron Islands," Daenerys said, "under your own law. If you choose to bend the knee as a gesture, bend. If you choose not to, do not. I will expect only that you do not prey on men who cannot fight back. If you do, you will hear dragon." Yara grinned, delighted to be named and threatened in one breath. "That's fair enough. Dorne is already nearly gone from our grasp. Varys murmured where those near him could hear. They tasted the independence of distance long ago. The Stormlands? Someone called. Gendry stood, awkward and strong. I take no pleasure in men bending to me, he said roughly. But if we must bend somewhere, let it be tied well. I'll bend to a throne that will hear when rain knocks. Daenerys lifted her chin, thinking in front of everyone because that was the kind of queen she chose to be. We will have a council, she said, the word shaped like a new bridge. A small one who can make fast decisions in crisis. A large one who will be the realm's voice when the crisis is done. The crown will speak and be held to account. The regions will rule themselves in the manner they know best. You may call me queen or call me breaker. I will not sit this throne today. I will sit when you have built the body around it. A murmur like the wind in a wheat field moved through the hall. Tyrion felt the old happiness, the little, sharp thing that comes when an impossible plan sneaks into the world and finds it fits. And Cersei? Someone called. What of the crimes? She will be tried, Daenerys said. By us, not by fire, by words. The last had more bite than the others because she had learned its cost. The trial took a day and a half. The first day was a parade of grief. Men spoke who had lost sons to the wildfire Cassius Qyburn had set under her orders and her orders to him, to be prepared. Women spoke who had seen their husbands dragged to cells for thinking of banners in the wrong color. Sam stood and explained the difference between disobedience and treason with a clarity that even those who took pleasure in misunderstanding could not easily twist. Tyrion spoke of children and of cruelty and of how often those two had shared rooms in the palace of his youth. Brienne spoke once, her voice very low, and it changed the air. She spoke of a promise made by a man who had thought himself foul and had been at his best when he believed himself able to be better. Jaime did not speak. He sat with his head bowed and his hand on his knee. He had a gift for silence when it could be used to save, and he used it. Cersei listened like a woman who had come to the last chapter of the wrong book and was angry that the ending did not attend to her needs. She had a speech ready. She always did, and she made it, and it moved some and angered more. When it was done, and when the sides had shouted themselves hoarse, and when the day had bleached white with listening, then the verdict was given. Not death. Not freedom. A life in a tower by the sea, with company chosen by the council, with letters to be written when she repented and questioned if she did. It was in that sentence as much mercy as those who had lost everything could bear to give. It was perhaps more wisdom than they knew. To live long is harder punishment than to die proud. Jaime asked to go with her. It was denied by a vote that was not unkindness. He accepted it like a man who had expected to be denied and did not want to be given a gift too easily. The days that followed, summer came hard. The air lost its bite on the tongue. Light filled spaces it had shunned, and the city acquired 1,000 small kindnesses. Grey Worm had the look of a man who had set down a sword he had forgotten had weight. Missandei began to speak of Noth in a way that made the word sound grown, not as the wistful song of a slave but as a woman's intention. Daenerys listened and said, in a quiet hour, "Go!" Missandei's mouth trembled. Grey Worm bowed and said he would accompany her and guard the island from those who would come with wickedness now that the world had learned the name. Daenerys kissed her friend's forehead and did not let her tears fall before she had turned away. Yara sailed west with the sun slamming gold into all her sails. She left behind a silence burned down to stubborn bones, and she took with her that little bone from her pocket and threw it into the sea when they passed the place where she had put her axe into Euron's heart, because the dead are an ocean and you return them what you can. Brienne wrote in a book with careful hand. She wrote the truth that mattered about Jaime and left out the truth that belonged to hers and his private grief. She closed the book gently when she had finished and laid her palm atop it like a benediction. Tyrion took up the position he had always been made for and always feared, hand. He learned the names of the men who cleaned the gutters and the women who salted meat and the children who stole apples and brought them to their mother, because stealing to feed the hungry is different than stealing to grow a hoard. He learned where the wells ran slow and where the sewers stank worst and where the city's anger pooled. He moved money like water through a series of ditches Sam drew with ink and a kind of naive brilliance. He made Davos master of ships thou. the man protested. Davos then ran his thumb along the carved ships at the edge of the war table and said, "We have to teach lads to sail without falling in love with dying." Sansa returned north. Arya did not. She looked west at a sea no one had charted with good ink and answered the question she had been asking since she was a child. What else? She went on a good ship with a captain who respected the sword at her side and the way she watched wind before he did. She sent no letters at first. Some lives are only ever truly lived if no one looks and names it as it goes. Jon came to Daenerys in a garden made new behind the Red Keep where someone had found a store of seed, and some of the old gardeners had returned as if drawn by song to the work they knew when they had names. He had a look on his face like a man who had come a long way to ask a simple question. "I cannot be your husband," he said, too honest for any careful preface. She accepted it. She had learned to accept one blow at least before bracing for the next. "And you cannot be my king," she said. A little smile of a bitter lightness that made him love her more, not less. "I can be your sword," he said, "and your counsel, and your friend, if that is allowed kings and queens." "It is allowed me," she said, and a measure of pain bled from her shoulders. "Do you want the north?" "I want it free," he said. "Not mine. Sansa will keep it so." "And your name?" She did not mean Snow. He looked at the trees that had been planted in the garden. Some light-leafed, some heavy, none a weirwood but all good. He took a breath. "I'll keep it," he said, "and when I die it can be written in whatever book men still keep. But while I live, I'll be Jon." She nodded once. "Then be him, and help me. I don't know how to make this a world where a throne is a chair and not a promise of a pyre." "We'll learn it," he said, "with mistakes, with counsel, with bells." Her hand found his. It fit like a learned language, and they stood in the new garden while the city turned to summer and the smell of basil and wet soil rose up between old stones. In the Iron Islands, Yara stood on a cliff and let the wind beat her and thought of a boy who had died at Winterfell and smiled in the last moment with something like peace. She sang him a salt song and then a sweeter one she had learned from a mainland girl once, and she turned and went back to the work of being queen of a place that was used to kings. If any man doubted her, she threw him into the sea and had him hauled out and told him the sea had more sense than he, and in time the doubt washed away as if it had only been foam on rock. In King's Landing the throne sat. Some days it was used. Some days it was not. The council room filled with voices that sounded like argument and were sometimes music and sometimes merely noise. On the days when the noise grew too much, Daenerys went where the dragons slept in the shadow of the keep and sat close enough to feel their warmth and far enough that the heat did not blister. They said a queen named Daenerys had found a new kind of fire. They said a woman named Yara had broken a chain to catch a monster and had managed to be prouder of the knot than the blood it drew. They said, "To less sharp," she said, and they drank, and somewhere above them a bell chimed because a gust had found it, and someone outside laughed because sometimes weather feels like blessing. On a summer morning, Jon rode out alone beyond the city where the road dips and then rises and you can see brown fields that will be yellow when the week turns. He stopped on the rise and looked back. The city had fewer scars than the last time he had looked. Smoke rose only where it belonged. A flock of birds moved in one of those strange sudden turns that looks like one mind in 100 bodies. He thought of the wall and then did not. He thought of a cave and then did not. He thought of a woman with silver hair who had asked a bell to stay her hand and had obeyed it, and he did not resist that thought. He rode on. In a place where the road bent around a copse, a child waved a stick like a sword at him. He dismounted and showed the boy how to hold it so his wrist would not tire. The mother thanked him and offered him a plum. He bit the plum and juice ran over his knuckles. He licked it off and tasted summer. At Dragonstone, when the wind was right, you could hear the sea speak the old tongue it had spoken on the morning Yara had stood with Jon Snow and learned to love a plan more than a chance at rage. On those days, the castle seemed to lean just a little closer to the cliff, listening, as if even stone likes to hear how a story turned after it was told. And what the sea said was not complicated. It was not any of the words men had beaten into their own shape. It said only what it always did, again and again. But for a time that meant a different return, not of fire but of waking, and it was enough.